By the early 2000s, every major American hand tool company was running the same calculation. Labor in Shenzhen cost a fraction of labor in Pennsylvania. Tooling could be replicated. Shipping was cheap. The math was obvious to everyone in the industry, and nearly everyone acted on it. Someone acted on it by making a phone call to Meadville. The offer came with a number most family businesses never see, the kind of number that ends arguments before they start. The D. Arments, 4 generations deep into the same factory on South Main Street, listened to the offer, considered it, and declined. No production line moved. No jobs were transferred overseas. Not one pair of pliers shifted to a factory in China, Taiwan, or anywhere else. The building stayed, the equipment stayed, the family stayed. In the years that followed, the companies that did sell watched their names survive on paper and disappear everywhere else. Brand names that had meant something in American tool chests for decades became labels on import packaging, attached to tools made by workers who had never heard of the towns that built those reputations. The consolidation was rapid and nearly total. By the end of the decade, the American hand tool industry as it had existed for a century was largely gone. Channellock was still in Meadville, but the real story of Channellock is not about one phone call, and it is not about one decision made in one decade. It is the story of 5 generations of a single family who kept answering the same question, the same way, across 140 years of American industrial history, through depressions and wars and recessions, and the most sustained assault on domestic manufacturing this country has ever seen. Every week, we tell the stories behind the machines and the companies that built the modern world. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Evansburg, Pennsylvania, in 1886. George B. DeArmond was 33 years old in 1886. He was a blacksmith from Evansburg, Pennsylvania, a small settlement in the northwestern corner of the state, in a region where the economy ran on agriculture, horses, and the trades that kept both alive. Evansburg had no railroad junction, no significant industry, and no particular reason to appear on a map of American commerce. It was exactly the kind of place a man with ambition and a forge could either leave or build something in. DeArmond chose to build. A farrier, the craftsman who shapes and applies iron shoes to horse hooves, needed specific tools to do the work. Hoof parers for trimming the hoof wall, nippers for cutting, rasps for smoothing. These were not decorative objects. They were working instruments subjected to enormous force, used on animals that weighed 1,000 pounds and did not always stand still. A tool that failed in the middle of a horseshoeing job did not merely inconvenience a craftsman, it could injure him. What DeArmond understood, through the experience of a working blacksmith rather than the analysis of a businessman, was that the tools available to him were not good enough. So he made better ones. The process had a rhythm to it that suited the seasons of northwestern Pennsylvania. Through the cold months, October through March, when the roads turned to mud and then froze solid, DeArmond worked his forge. He designed hoof parers and nippers, heated bar stock to cherry red, hammered it against the anvil face, quenched it in water, and tested the edge. He refined the geometry. He adjusted the steel. He did this hundreds of times across the winter months until he had a stock of tools he believed in. When spring arrived and the roads became passable again, he loaded the tools into a wagon and set out. He traveled from town to town across rural Pennsylvania, selling to blacksmiths and farriers who recognized quality when they held it. When the last tool was sold and the wagon was empty, DeArmond sold the horse and wagon as well, walked to the nearest railroad station, and bought a ticket back to Evansburg. Then he started over. This is not a metaphor. This is what he actually did, repeatedly, across the early years of the company. He converted his entire operation to cash at the end of each selling season and rebuilt it from scratch the following winter. It was a business model built on the assumption that the product was good enough to sell itself, and it was. By 1891, the reputation had grown far enough that DeArmond gave the enterprise its first formal name, the Champion Tool Company. In 1893, disaster arrived. A bank teller at the local institution where the company held its accounts walked out with the depositors' funds. The Champion Tool Company lost everything it had in that bank. DeArmond had no insurance, no reserves held elsewhere, and no fallback position. He was, by any reasonable accounting, finished. He was not finished. With the help of his wife Eva and a handful of local businessmen who believed in his work, DeArmond raised enough capital to restart operations by 1894. The company absorbed the blow, recovered its footing, and kept moving. That same quality of response, the refusal to accept a setback as a conclusion, would define the DeArmond family's relationship with adversity for the next 130 years. In August 1902, a letter arrived from England. The royal horseshoer to King Edward VII, the newly crowned monarch of the British Empire, had placed an order for a complete set of champion farrier's tools. A blacksmith from a Pennsylvania village with no railroad stop was supplying the tools used on the horses of the British royal household. DeArmond had not advertised in London. He had not sought a royal endorsement. The tools had found their own reputation. By 1904, the business had outgrown Evansburg entirely. The town of Meadville, the county seat of Crawford County, 30 miles to the northwest, offered something Evansburg could not: a 12,000-square-foot manufacturing facility, better rail access, and a growing industrial workforce. The Champion Bolt and Clipper Company, the name had evolved as the product line grew, relocated to Meadville and never left. The company added nippers, pinchers, and open-end wrenches. In 1911, George's two sons, Almond W. DeArmond and J. Howard DeArmond, became partners in the firm. The second generation was in place. In 1923, the company moved again to a 33,000-square-foot facility at its permanent address on South Main Street. 4 years later, J. Howard DeArmond died. Almond was now alone at the helm of a company that needed a new direction. The farrier's tool market that had built the business was shrinking rapidly. Horses were being replaced by automobiles and tractors. The craftsmen who had been Champion's core customers were an aging and diminishing profession. Whatever had made George DeArmond's company successful in 1886, the same product line could not carry it into the 1930s. Almond changed the company name to Champion DeArmond Tool Company and began looking for what came next. He found it in the hands of his chief engineer. 1739. George B. DeArmond's sons inherited a company with a problem. The farrier's tool market, the foundation their father had built everything on, was collapsing beneath them. Between 1910 and 1930, the number of working horses in the United States fell by roughly a third as gasoline engines replaced animal power on farms and city streets. The craftsmen who shod those horses were retiring, dying, and not being replaced. A tool company whose identity was tied to a disappearing trade had a simple choice: change or follow the trade into obsolescence. Almond DeArmond chose to change. He hired Howard Manning as chief engineer. Manning was a tool man in the practical sense, a problem solver who thought in metal and mechanics rather than in sales projections and market reports. In 1933, with the Great Depression compressing every dollar in the American economy and the industrial tool market at its weakest point in a generation, Manning brought Almond a design that neither of them could have known would define the company for the next century. The tool Manning had developed was a pair of pliers, but not like any pliers then in common use. The standard slip-joint plier had existed for decades. It worked by means of a pivot pin set into one of two positions, open or closed, that allowed the jaws to grip at two different widths. The design was simple and adequate, but its limitations were real. Two positions was not always enough. Moving from one position to the other loosened the joint under load. The pin bore every bit of the stress placed on the tool, which meant that under serious torque, the plier distorted or failed. Manning's solution addressed all of this at once. He replaced the simple pin slot with a curved channel, a groove machined into one jaw, and a corresponding tongue on the other. The tongue sat inside the groove and could slide to any of several positions along the curve, then lock under load. The geometry of the curve was the key. When force was applied to the handles, the tongue was driven deeper into the groove rather than pulled free of it. The harder the user squeezed, the more firmly the joint locked. The shear force, the sideways stress that destroyed conventional plier pins, was transferred to the curved channel wall, which had far more surface area to absorb it. Only a modest tensile load remained on the pin itself. In plain terms, the plier could be set to grip at multiple widths. It would not slip under load. It would not fail under stress. And it could be adjusted, jaw to jaw, in a matter of seconds to fit a pipe, a bolt head, a nut, or a fitting of almost any size the user encountered. Manning named the design the Channellock. The name described exactly what the mechanism did, a channel that locked. A patent application was filed in 1933, and the patent was granted in 1934. U.S. Patent number 1,950,362 in Howard Manning's name. Champion de-armament moved quickly to trademark the name Channellock, which would be formally registered in 1949 with a documented first use date of May 1, 1932. The company was not slow to understand what it had. The development of the tongue and groove plier, as an internal assessment would have told them clearly, had not merely added a product to the line. It had made the rest of the line irrelevant by comparison. The price point reflected both the tool's value and the economic reality of the era. In 1933, with the Depression at its depth and the average industrial worker earning between $15 and $20 a week, Champion de-armament priced the original Channellock at a level competitive with other quality hand tools, accessible to the tradesman who needed it for daily work, not reserved for the professional shop with a full equipment budget. Cornwell Tool Company, one of the premier professional tool distributors in America, was carrying Champion de-armament Channellock models in its catalog by 1936. Bonnie Tools listed them as well. These were not discount channels. These were the suppliers to working professionals, and they stocked what working professionals trusted. The go-to-market strategy was direct and deliberate. Champion de-armament did not attempt to reach every hardware store in America at once. They went through the trade distributors, the catalogs and sales networks that already had relationships with plumbers, pipe fitters, electricians, and mechanics. These were the men who worked with pipe and conduit and fittings every day, who needed a tool that could grip a 2-inch pipe and then, 3 seconds later, grip a 3/4-inch nut without stopping to swap tools. The Channellock did both. The tradesman who used one understood its value immediately and rarely went back to anything else. The moat Champion de-armament built was not a patent alone. Patents expire. The moat was reputation, accumulated one transaction at a time, through distributors who staked their own credibility on the tools they carried. By the time the original Channellock patent expired in 1951, the company was ready with a second-generation design, improvements to the tongue geometry and channel profile, and filed for new protection. The engineering never stopped. The product was never declared finished. The strategy created a customer relationship that no competitor could buy their way into. The Channellock plier arrived at exactly the right moment. American industry in the mid-1930s was beginning its long climb out of the Depression, and the tradesmen who kept that industry running, the pipe fitters, plumbers, electricians, and mechanics, needed tools that could do more than one thing without failing under load. The Channellock did precisely that. Word moved through the trade channels the way useful things move among working people, quickly and without advertising. By 1936, Champion de-armament pliers appeared in the catalog of the H. Channon Company, one of the major industrial distributors based in Chicago. That same year, Cornwell Tool Company, which sold exclusively to professional mechanics and tradesmen, was carrying 5 Channellock models in its catalog alongside battery pliers and diagonal cutters. Bonnie Tools listed them as well. And by around 1936, Champion de-armament had secured something that no amount of trade catalog placement could have bought: a manufacturing contract with Sears Roebuck to supply pliers for the Craftsman brand. The pliers that American homeowners and hobbyists were buying under the Craftsman name, the pliers they trusted because Sears stood behind them with a lifetime guarantee, were coming off the factory floor in Meadville, Pennsylvania. The railroad maintenance crews of the Pennsylvania Railroad used Channellock pliers on rolling stock that moved freight and passengers across the eastern half of the continent. Municipal water departments in cities across the industrial Midwest relied on them for pipework on systems that served hundreds of thousands of people. Oil refineries along the Gulf Coast stocked them for the maintenance crews who kept high-pressure systems running at temperatures and tolerances that destroyed lesser tools. These were not casual customers. These were industries where a tool failure did not mean inconvenience. It meant a shutdown, an injury, or worse. Then December 7, 1941 arrived, and every calculation in American manufacturing changed overnight. Within weeks of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the War Production Board began allocating American industrial capacity to military requirements. Factories that had been making consumer goods were redirected, retooled, or simply commandeered. Champion de-armament, like every other manufacturer capable of contributing to the war effort, received its orders. Production priorities shifted. The factory on South Main Street in Meadville did not close. It accelerated. The specific military contracts Champion de-armament fulfilled during the war years reflected what the company was: a precision metal forming operation capable of producing tools that had to work under the worst conditions a human being could encounter. Pliers and hand tools were not glamorous war production. They did not appear in recruitment posters or newsreel footage. But every naval vessel that left an American shipyard, every tank that rolled off an assembly line, every bomber that required maintenance between missions carried the hand tools that kept it operational. When a pump failed aboard a destroyer in the Pacific, the machinist's mate who repaired it reached for tools. When an engine needed adjustment on an airfield in England in the middle of the night before a bombing run, the crew chief reached for tools. The women who moved into the Meadville factory while the men were overseas learned the machinery quickly. They ran the drop forges. They operated the heat-treating furnaces. They worked the second shift and the third shift because the military contracts did not have off days. The factory ran through the war years at a pace it had never reached before, producing tools that were shipped to depots and then forward to theaters of operation across 2 oceans. By the time the war ended in 1945, Champion de-armament had proven something important. The quality standards that had built its civilian reputation, the drop-forged construction, the precision geometry of the tongue and groove joint, the heat treatment that gave the steel its edge retention, were the same standards that had made it a reliable military supplier. Quality was not a sales position. It was a manufacturing discipline, and it survived the pressure of wartime production without compromise. The post-war period brought expansion at a pace the company had never seen. Returning veterans built houses and bought cars and needed tools. The trades expanded. The construction industry grew. The Channellock plier, already the dominant tongue and groove design on the American market, rode that expansion directly. In 1951, the original Manning patent expired. This was the moment every competitor had been waiting for. The tongue and groove geometry was now free for anyone to copy. Several did. But Champion de-armament had not waited for that moment passively. The company's engineers had spent the intervening years developing improvements to the original design, refinements to the channel geometry, improvements to the surface hardening of the gripping teeth, changes to the pivot system that made the adjustment smoother and more reliable. A second-generation patent was filed, and the company continued producing pliers that competitors were now legally permitted to copy, but practically unable to match. In 1956, the company introduced what would become one of its most durable competitive assets, a trademarked shade of sky blue applied to the grip handles. The color was not decorative, it was identification. A plumber who owned Channellock pliers knew where they were in a pile of tools. An electrician who dropped one on a job site could see it. A mechanic whose toolbox contained a dozen different brands could reach directly for the one he wanted. The color became so associated with quality tongue and groove pliers that it entered the visual vocabulary of the American trades the way the red soles of certain shoes entered the vocabulary of fashion, as an instant signal about what the object was and who made it. By 1963, that signal had become the company's name. The word Channellock had traveled the same path as Kleenex, Band-Aid, and Thermos before it, from trademark to common noun. Plumbers across America asked hardware store clerks for channel locks, regardless of manufacturer. Electricians told apprentices to grab the channel lock from the bag. The genericization was so complete and so commercially significant that the de-armament family took the only logical action available. They changed the company name to Channellock, Incorporated, protecting the trademark by making it indistinguishable from the corporate identity itself. It was not a marketing decision. It was an act of legal self-defense by a family that understood, by then, exactly what they had built. In 1980, William S. de-armament became the 4th generation of his family to run the company. He inherited a Channellock that was profitable, well-regarded, and facing a set of external pressures that had no precedent in the company's history. The threat was not a single competitor. It was a structural shift in the economics of global manufacturing. Japanese and Taiwanese tool producers had been exporting hand tools to the American market since the 1960s, but the scale and sophistication of that competition accelerated through the 1970s in ways that caught much of the domestic industry unprepared. By the early 1980s, imported pliers were appearing on hardware store shelves at prices that American manufacturers could not match without fundamentally changing how they operated. The labor cost differential was not marginal. A factory worker in Taiwan earned a fraction of what a factory worker in Pennsylvania earned. A pair of tongue and groove pliers that cost Channellock a certain amount to forge, grind, heat treat, and assemble in Meadville could be produced overseas for significantly less, and the price difference showed up directly on the shelf tag. Every American hand tool company confronted the same arithmetic in the same decade. Most of them reached the same conclusion: move production offshore, retain the brand name, and let the consumer absorb the quality difference slowly enough not to notice. Billings and Spencer, gone, absorbed, then gone again through a chain of conglomerate acquisitions. Herbrand Tools of Fremont, Ohio, which had been forging wrenches since 1881, was acquired and eventually dissolved. Bonnie Utica and the entire Triangle Tool Group disappeared into Cooper Industries. Armstrong Tools, a century-old American wrench manufacturer, was absorbed by Danaher and gradually hollowed out. Western Forge, once the largest American screwdriver manufacturer, survived into the 21st century before finally closing in 2020. The names persisted longer than the factories. The factories went first, then the names followed. Channellock did not move. William D. Arment's response to the import pressure was not passive resistance. It was a deliberate set of decisions made across the 1980s that accepted the reality of the competitive landscape without accepting its apparent conclusion. The company invested in process improvement rather than geographic relocation. In 1984, Channellock engineers developed and patented the Permalock fastener, a design improvement to the tongue and groove mechanism that eliminated a point of wear in the joint and made the adjustment system more durable over the life of the tool. The improvement cost engineering time and tooling investment. It did not reduce the price of the plier. It increased the gap between what a Channellock would do after 10 years of daily professional use and what an imported alternative would do after the same period. The company bet every year that enough of its customers cared about that gap to keep paying for it. Then the 1990s arrived and the arithmetic got worse. China's emergence as a manufacturing base for hand tools represented a cost structure that made Taiwan look expensive. By the mid-1990s, generic tongue and groove pliers in a Channellock adjacent profile were available at retail for prices that undercut even the Taiwanese competition. The Walmart effect, the systematic pressure on every supplier in every category to reduce prices annually or lose shelf placement, was restructuring the economics of American retail hardware. A tool company that refused to participate in that price compression either found customers who would pay a premium for American-made quality, or it shrank. Channellock found its customers, but finding them required something the company had never needed before: a conscious articulation of what it was and why that mattered. The trademarked blue handle, once simply a visual identifier, became a statement of origin and intent. The South Main Street address, once simply a location, became a competitive argument. Being made in Meadville, Pennsylvania was not just a fact about the supply chain. It was the product's primary claim on the professional tradesmen who had used Channellock pliers for 20 years and knew precisely what they did under load. William D. Arment understood something that the companies abandoning American manufacturing did not fully account for. The professional tradesman is not the same customer as the weekend consumer. A plumber who uses pliers 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 30 years does not buy on price. He buys on performance history, on the knowledge that the tool in his hand will not fail at the moment it matters most. That customer is not easily converted to an imported alternative by a lower shelf price. He has already done the experiment, often involuntarily, and he has reached his own conclusions. The company's workforce in Meadville was also not simply a cost line. It was institutional knowledge, accumulated across decades, about how to forge, grind, and finish pliers to a tolerance that a machine set up on the other side of the world, operated by workers who had never touched the tools in a professional context, could not easily replicate. When Channellock introduced automation in the 1980s and 1990s, the automation was added specifically to the most repetitive and physically demanding tasks: the polishing operations, the material handling between forging and heat treatment. Bill DeArmond would later describe the approach carefully. The robots were not called robots at first because the workers were afraid. They were called pick-and-place units. Nobody was laid off. Employees were retrained and in some cases moved into higher-paying technical roles. The workforce shrank through attrition, not termination. The knowledge stayed in Meadville. By the early 2000s, the American hand tool industry as it had existed for a century was largely unrecognizable. The brands remained. The factories were gone. Craftsman tools were being made in China. Vice Grip was on its way to Nebraska and then China. The Sears catalog, which had once been the primary distribution channel for American-made tools across every hardware category, was irrelevant to anyone under 50 and failing commercially for everyone else. The phone calls came. Offers arrived. Numbers were placed on the table that represented the liquidation value of everything George B. Darman had started in Evansburg in 1886, and everything 5 generations had built since. The Darmans declined. The factory stayed. The name stayed. The address stayed. 365 people kept their jobs in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, in a decade when American manufacturing employment fell by more than 2 million workers nationally. That decision was not made once. It was made again and again, year after year, generation after generation, by a family that had inherited 4 principles from a blacksmith who sold tools from the back of a wagon and believed they were worth following. Good management is never far from the factory floor. People count more than machines. Bigger does not always mean better. And dedication to excellence is the surest way to surmount adversity and prosper. The siege lasted 40 years. The factory is still standing. The factory on South Main Street in Meadville is still there. It has been there, on the same address since 1923. Some sections of the original floor still have end-grain woodblock underfoot, the same flooring that absorbed the oil and vibration of forging hammers a century ago. The building did not become a condominium development. It did not become a distribution center for imported goods with an American name on the box. It is a working factory, running 2 shifts, forging steel into pliers the same way it has done since Howard Manning drew his first channel and tongue sketch in 1933. Channellock today operates 2 facilities in Meadville, totaling 260,000 square feet. The company employs more than 350 full-time associates, making it among the largest private employers in Crawford County, Pennsylvania. It manufactures more than 120 patterns of pliers and screwdrivers, shipping millions of tools each year across the United States and to 60 countries. Every pair of non-locking pliers, every pair of snips, every professional driver and pry bar and ratcheting wrench carries a simple, unambiguous declaration, made in the USA. The 5th generation of the DeArmond family runs the operation. John DeArmond, who began his time at the company mowing lawns and sweeping floors during college breaks, served as president and COO from 2014 until transitioning to EVP of Manufacturing and Engineering in 2025. His brother Ryan DeArmond serves as executive vice president of sales and marketing. Their father, William DeArmond, who took the helm in 1980 and steered the company through the most sustained import pressure in American manufacturing history, remains chairman of the board. The family is still present. The management is still present. The principle that good management is never far from the factory floor is still operational, not decorative. The secondary market for vintage Champion DeArmond and early Channellock pliers tells its own story. On the Garage Journal Forum, one of the most active communities of tool collectors and working tradesmen in America, threads dedicated to vintage Champion DeArmond tools run to hundreds of posts, with collectors trading, restoring, and dating pairs from the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. A pre-1963 pair of number 420 Channellock pliers in clean condition, still bearing the raised Champion DeArmond stamp, sells regularly on the used market for prices that would surprise anyone who thinks of pliers as disposable. They are not bought for display. They are bought because the men and women who use hand tools professionally know what drop-forged steel from that era does under load, and they trust it in a way that a shelf tag cannot manufacture. There is a practical reason for this that has nothing to do with nostalgia. A pair of tongue-and-groove pliers forged from high-carbon steel, properly hardened and tempered, does not wear out in a human lifetime of professional use. The teeth, laser heat treated in modern production, case hardened in the old, retain their bite through years of daily contact with pipe, conduit, fittings, and fasteners. An older plier that has been maintained and not abused is not a museum object. It is a working tool, and it works. A plumber dealing with a severely corroded fitting on 60-year-old galvanized pipe, applying maximum torque in a confined space at an awkward angle, does not reach for something that might flex. He reaches for something he has used before and trusts completely. The surprise footnote in the Channellock story is not hidden in the archives. It is right on the surface, so familiar that it goes unnoticed. George B. DeArmond was a blacksmith who could not find tools good enough to do his work. So he made better ones and sold them from the back of a wagon. He articulated 4 principles about how a business should operate, about the relationship between management and workers, about scale, about quality, and he embedded those principles in the company's identity rather than its marketing materials. His great-great-grandchildren still run the company on South Main Street in Meadville. They still invoke those 4 principles by name. Not one of his 4 principles mentions profit. Not one mentions market share. Not one mentions competitive positioning. They are principles about how to treat people, how to make things, and what to do when things get hard. The surprise is that they worked. For 140 years, without interruption, across 5 generations, through a depression and a world war, and 40 years of the most aggressive offshore competition the American manufacturing sector has ever confronted, they worked. The American tool industry that existed when Channellock was founded in 1886 is almost entirely gone. The names that filled hardware catalogs and trade publications for a century, Billings and Spencer, Herbrand, Bonney, Utica, Armstrong, Barcelo, are artifacts now, subjects of collector forums and industrial history blogs. The factories are empty lots, parking structures, apartment buildings. The knowledge that accumulated in those buildings over generations dispersed when the workers retired and the equipment was sold for scrap. Meadville, Pennsylvania kept one factory. What Channellock represents is not a story about one exceptional company. It is a proof of concept, a demonstration that American manufacturing does not fail because it cannot compete. It fails when the people who run it decide that the cost of competing is higher than the value of what they are competing to preserve. The Darmonts decided differently, 5 times in 5 generations, at the moments when the decision mattered. The forging hammers on South Main Street are still running. The steel goes in cold. The pliers come out blue. Exactly as a blacksmith from Evansburg designed them to be 140 years ago, made by hand, sold from a wagon for anyone willing to pay for something that would not let them down. See you in the next one.